Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion the night before the election, Understanding the Latino Vote, sponsored by the University of Houston Center for Mexican American Studies. My name is Jason Casellas. I'm an associate professor of political science here at the University of Houston, and I'll be the moderator for this panel. I'm excited about our panel. We have a great selection of guests who are going to talk about what's going to happen tomorrow, which is election day, as you all know. We have a lot to anticipate here tomorrow. We have our group of panelists, which I'll briefly introduce, and then we'll try to get right into it. We're coming together because of a couple reports that have been recently released. The Texas Organizing Project Education Fund has released a report called Real Talk, Understanding Texas Latino Voters Through Meaningful Conversation. And so that had some fascinating findings. And so we want to talk a little bit about that. And then also the Center for Mexican American Studies and University of Houston released a recent pre-election poll with results among Latino registered voters in Texas and of course across the United States. So today I'd like to introduce our panelists. First panelist, Cecilia Ballí. She's the principal and founder of Culture Concepts. She's trained as an anthropologist. She's also an author of Texas Monthly and recently wrote a really fascinating piece, which I highly recommend, on the Texas Latino vote. And I'm sure she'll talk a little bit about that in a second. We also have Professor Jeronimo Cortina, who's the Associate Director of the Center for Mexican American Studies and an Associate Professor of Political Science, who was a principal investigator in the poll that I just mentioned. Also, we have Professor Brandon Rottinghaus, who's a professor of political science at the University of Houston and the director of the UH Election Lab, which I'm sure he'll talk a little bit about later, who's also an investigator on that poll. And then finally, we have Michelle Tremillo, the executive director of the Texas Organizing Project, who will also say a few words about the report. While our presenters are making their presentations, I encourage you to use the chat feature on Zoom, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end. And what I'll do is I'll monitor the chat box, and hopefully we'll have time, so I'll present those questions to our panel. Okay, so without further ado, let me start with Cecilia Ballí, who will start off saying a little bit more about the report and perhaps a little bit about the article I mentioned. Cecilia?
Thanks, Jason, and thank you all at Center for Mexican American Studies for this invitation. Gives me a way to pass the time and calm my anxieties the day before the election. This study that I'm presenting today is a nonpartisan study, as Jason mentioned, that was commissioned and funded by the Texas Organizing Project Education Fund. And Michelle from TOP will speak a bit about the reasons for that study and what implications it has for political organizers. I came in on the research side. I'm an anthropologist, and I worked on a team with two other colleagues who are actually in attendance today. I want to acknowledge them. Michael Powell, who's an anthropologist as well, and Betsabeth Monica Lugo, who is a sociologist. And Monica was actually a visiting assistant professor at UH CMAS in sociology in 2016 to 2018. So this is a homecoming for her. We did a study throughout the past year and a half from design to release. It was a year and a half study where we interviewed 100 Latino eligible voters in a total of 105 regions of Texas: Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, El Paso, and the Valley. And we were trying to understand more deeply this question of voter turnout and engagement with government more broadly. So when we hear these narratives in the press and by pundits that Latinos don't turn out to vote as much as we want them to, I always felt a bit underwhelmed by the explanation. And as an anthropologist, I wondered if there weren't other factors that we needed to consider. One of the common myths we've decided it's a myth is that they don't vote because they're apathetic or they don't care about government. And so that was a driving force behind the study. We did 2-hour interviews with individuals. So we didn't even do focus groups. We wanted the ability to ask follow-up questions from people and really use an ethnographic approach. And this is important because it fills in the holes that quantitative research can't always respond to fully. For example, trying to determine why someone doesn't vote. If you ask them that question, they're not able to answer it, directly. They often can't explain very quickly why they don't vote. And then you start to hear their experiences and their views, and you piece it together. So it's quite a broad study. And the article for Texas Monthly is actually exploring that study. It's just in storytelling form. I'll share the links to both in the chat room when I'm done, in case anybody wants to review them. Today, I want to share with you a few of the findings, the most interesting findings. I'm going to show you a slideshow, and we'll just kind of touch on a few important points from each one of them. I'm hitting play. Is it? Sorry, it's making me wait. Can you see it now? Yes, thank you. Well, first we wanted to compare, what differentiates voters from non-voters. There isn't a simple answer, a simple formula as to this will make you a voter and this won't make you a voter. But so we started comparing how voters and non-voters speak and what kind of life experiences they've had. And basically, voters, talk about voting with a sense of confidence about the importance of it. So voting is a way that you make sure you count as a person, that your voice gets heard. There's a lot of that discourse of your vote being your voice. Voting is a duty, and you vote even if you think that the system doesn't work well, even if you think it's corrupt or dysfunctional, you participate in it, and you vote even if your candidate or your party doesn't have a chance of winning. But more broadly, we heard voters speak with a sense of empowerment and a sense of belonging. And these are things that reflected in other parts of their life. Whatever class level or educational level they had had experiences in their life where they felt like they belonged, they felt like part of their community, or they felt like a citizen, and they felt that they could make a difference in their life and specifically in electoral outcomes. Non-voters, by contrast, are basically the opposite of that. But critically, we found that they were not apathetic. And what we mean by that, how did we determine that? Is that non-voters were actually following political news. The vast majority of them were talking about, particular figures that have been in the news lately. They could speak in informed ways, even about the impeachment proceedings in some cases, not all cases. They had very strong opinions about policy issues, government, and even democracy. We would ask them, do you think our country has a functioning democracy? And they all had opinions about this. So it's not that they were not engaging or thinking about government. Instead, so the main thing with non-voters is they weren't sure their vote mattered. And I think this is important for organizers and political campaigns, is how can you better communicate and convince somebody that their vote matters, even if their candidate doesn't win, for example. We found that there were more broadly a sense of disempowerment, or rather they had less agency over other areas of their life as well, and a lower sense of belonging. For example, we had non-voters in San Antonio that spoke about these long experiences of low expectations of them in school. And experiences like that, where you don't feel you belong or you don't feel you have as much control over your life, can color your view of the political system and spill over and make you a little, more uncertain that you can single-handedly can have some contributions, make a difference in the outcome. There is a correlation with income. Studies have shown this before, and ours was not quantitative, but among the 100 people we interviewed, there was a perfect correlation between income and voting frequency. Basically, the more educated or the higher income you have, the more likely you are to vote. Also, non-voting can become entrenched over generations. So if you have, third, fourth generation Mexican Americans, for example, who come from families that have not voted, and their own life hasn't changed very much, there hasn't been a lot of economic mobility, for instance, or social mobility, that attitude about voting not making a difference is going to become deeper. And so another myth is that Latinos don't vote in higher numbers because they're immigrants. And we actually found that the issue is a little more entrenched with US second, third generation Latinos. There are different pathways to get to voting if you're a non-voter, and those include like taking a course at school, becoming politically active, getting a message that you have to vote at church, in the workplace, through a political or community organization, or a family member being very insistent over time, wanting to discuss politics with you. And we also found that non-voters, as you see there, they're not really discussing politics with other people in their lives. And this was really crucial. We were reminded by this study that voting is underneath it all a social habit more than a rational choice. So we ask ourselves, you know, if this is going to impact your life, why doesn't someone get out and vote? And that assumes that someone is just sitting back making some sort of discernment in terms of what's rationally better for them. On the contrary, voting is more of a practice that you have to watch, and it has to be modeled by somebody, and you have to practice it over time until it starts to feel natural. And to the point where on election day, if you haven't gone out to vote, you feel guilty, right? And it's a habit that's not as established among Latinos, since a lot of them are newer voters. They don't come from families that have been voting for a long time. But this is where we have some sense of hope that those habits can be created and shared among Latinos, and that we can develop communities of voting. Very interestingly to us, you know, these are highly partisan times and debates in the news over politics. We expected to see some of that partisanship expressed by Latinos. And we observed that partisanship was delicate or weak among Latinos. And what we mean by that is there are people that consistently vote for one or another party, but they're not necessarily defending the party, using a lot of the discourse of the party. And so many people we interviewed would say that they were Democrat, but they would be willing to hear a candidate with a different viewpoint. You know, and the Republicans did the same. We were surprised by how often that came up. We also were surprised by how many people don't have a political affiliation. And I think this is one of those things where polls or quantitative research doesn't always capture, because we capture who people voted for, but you can vote Democrat and consider yourself not to have an affiliation or to be independent. And so in every single city, we were in the recruitment process, we were trying to find more Republicans or Democrats, and we kept getting all these people who wanted to participate and were independent or just said they didn't have any affiliation. We also think that another reason why there isn't high partisanship is the parties haven't engaged Latinos over time. So there isn't that reciprocal relationship that's developed. We don't have families that have been voting over time for one party and passing on that loyalty to their children. And also Latinos, a lot of them have very mixed views in terms of their ideology. They fall, depending on the issue, in different places on the spectrum. And finally, we captured some young Latino voters that are actually deciding to be independent as a protest against the two-party system that they feel is not working anymore to represent everybody's interests. On ethnicity and identity, this is a big subject, and I'll just give you a few key points. The rest is in the study. But as we all know, you know, Latino identity is not natural. It's a constructed category that's meant to include different ethnicities, different nationalities. And we always hear that there is a great diversity of views among Latinos because they're from different countries. We saw that diversity of opinion even among one class and one ethnicity. Just working class Mexican Americans, you will find every ideological position in that group. It's widely diverse. And so most people didn't feel that there is a Latino vote, a singular Latino vote, but they understood that it can be a strategic portion of the electorate that you can mobilize specifically, you know, in favor of the Democratic Party is the assumption, but that not everybody falls under that block. And the last thing I wanted to say is that when we talk about why don't Latinos vote the same way as Blacks, for instance, you know, I was interested in if Latinos are supposed to have a collective political agenda, it implies that they have collective ethnic politics, right? And a collective experience. And the interesting thing is that we found that to be kind of loose. And it wasn't because Latinos do not identify with their ethnicity. When we asked them if they've experienced discrimination or been made to feel different, almost every person we interviewed had. And so Latinos' lives are very much shaped by their ethnicity, but we don't have a strong way to make sense of it or talk about it. So this discourse of racism and systemic racism, it doesn't exist as much among Mexican Americans, and it's because we don't have a common narrative. We don't tell that story in history books about Latinos fighting for civil rights or experiencing racial lynchings in Texas, for example. So that's a really interesting area that I wish I could go on and on about. I need to wrap up here in a bit, but immigration, I think it probably comes as no surprise you've heard the argument that immigration is not the single issue that drives Latinos to vote. But I think political parties and candidates still think of Latino voters mostly as immigrants and as voters that mostly are voting on this issue. And I think, there's been a little talk about how President Trump may end up with more Latino support in 2020 than 2016. We're not sure, right? But that's out there, that idea. And it strikes me that, this is after family separations on the border, et cetera. And I think perhaps what that's showing us is that immigration isn't the issue that most drives Latinos voters to vote as a whole. There is a proportion that does, right? And so I think we have to rethink, or actually parties and candidates have to see Latino voters as voters that care about many more issues than in the end will be driven by other issues above immigration many times. So in closing, I think that we found that Latino voters are fairly new voters in the sense that, their families haven't been voting for a long time. And so we're in the process of developing voting practices and habits and communities of voting, as we say. But also there was a clear sense of disconnect or outright alienation from the political system. Latinos over and over really spoke to the fact that they don't think that the people leading them and in government really understand their realities. Even some of them who live in districts that are represented by Latino elected officials. And, there was a sense among the voters, they're going to participate, but they don't see their realities reflected. And they're not just looking for more Latino candidates. They were looking for candidates who actually understand what the experience is of a working class Mexican American or of a first generation Latino immigrant. So I think that, that relationship, Michelle will speak to that more, is it needs to be reciprocal. And I think the political system also needs to be developing that relationship at the same time as we continue to build voting practices among Latino communities. So thank you, and I'll hand it over to the next presenter.
Thank you, Cecilia, for sharing your insights and the results from your research. And let me just remind everyone, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll hopefully get to them at the end of the panel. Our next panelist is Brandon Rottinghaus, who can share a little bit with us the results of the survey. Brandon?
Yeah, thank you, Jason, and thanks to Jeronimo for setting this all up. Let me share my screen here. Let's see, can you all see that presentation? Yeah, okay, good. So we are on the very much the same pathway that that Cecilia and Top were on. In fact, we read her report and then looked at the Texas Monthly article and were like in a frenzy to try to get questions we could get to answer the really engaging things that were brought up by that. So in the spirit of that, I had sort of titled my talk that winning the Latino vote, but in fact, we need to, I think, go to like more basic level, and that's to understand the pathology of the Latino voter. So I think we were really inspired by that way of thinking, and the hope is that we can dig and really get some good details about what's really happening, because I'm not convinced that we know enough, and so maybe this is one step in that direction. We are seeing a lot of the same things that Cecilia and the top folks found, and so I'll talk about some of the specific findings. But there's a lot of it, right? And every 2 years, certainly over 4 years, there's an explosion of discussion about whether or not the Latino vote's going to come out and who they're going to break for. And I think that a lot of those same narratives get kind of trapped in this bubble, and we tend to kind of reinforce those same questions and same concepts. And there's a lot more to it than that. So we wanted to kind of probe a little bit farther. And so hopefully some of our polling has shown that we can do that. So as Jason said, this is from a very recently done Univision poll with the Center for Mexican American Studies. The poll was done nationally, and then they had subsamples of Latinos in various places: Arizona, Florida, Texas, and Pennsylvania. It was in the field a couple of weeks ago. And so we've got some fairly fresh, up-to-date data for people who can see the results. We found that basically Joe Biden was winning the Latino vote by about 65%. So it was a fairly substantial number. It's an intriguing question as to whether or not Donald Trump and or Republicans down ballot will get a bigger share of the vote. But as it is now, we're finding that the numbers are pretty stable at that. We did a poll in September that mostly showed the same thing. We were interested in the process for how Latino voters were connecting to the political system. And we decided that one way to cut into this was to ask people questions about how much contact they had had with the political world, especially whether or not they'd been reached out to by various groups. We found that 43% of Latinos reported no contact from a campaign, political party, or community organization. We found the numbers were slightly higher for the Democrats contacting women and younger voters. So clearly there's some targeting that has become more prominent. We did the same poll before 2016 in the election and found that that number was a lot higher. It was above 50%. And there was no group that was really getting a lot of interest. And so there has been some change on that, which I think is reflecting the fact that you're seeing higher turnout, as Jeronimo mentioned, and hope we'll get to when we talk about the turnout in Harris County, that there's a higher likelihood that Latinos will come out to vote. Few community groups were contacting. It was a lot of political parties that were doing it. So it was interesting to note that the part of specific metric was the specific contact group was primarily parties and candidates as opposed to different organizations. We found text messages were the primary way that people were being contacted, and followed by that phone. And after that, it was a lot of different ways. I'm curious to see how that might play out. I don't know if that's the best way to contact people or not. Obviously, it's technologically up to date, but if what we're learning is correct, it might be that some more involved method of connecting to voters is needed. We also ask people questions, as Cecilia alluded to, in a really interesting way about whether or not people are connecting to politics. And we found that there's a lot of ambivalence about politics generally. We specifically asked people the following question. We asked them if, whoever they vote for, that things go on pretty much the same. Did they agree with that statement? 57% of Latinos agreed with that statement, which is fairly high for a disaffected group. We also found that that number was much higher among younger groups, the younger voters. And this is really the future of Texas. And so to see that number so high was pretty dispiriting. We asked them a question and basically asked them to agree or disagree that government officials don't care about what people like me think. 65% of people agreed, highest among the middle age category, 30 to 50, basically. That's also pretty high, considering that this is a fairly basic function of representative government. We also asked them the following question: that do they agree or disagree with the following? Is it wishful thinking to believe that one can really influence what happens in society at large? And again, over 50% of people agreed. We actually found that for people who were interviewed in Spanish were more likely to say that they were disaffected in that way. So that was an interesting kind of artifact there of some of the data. So generally speaking, the Latino voters that the Latino registered voters that we were talking to were fundamentally disconnected from politics in all kinds of different ways. Specifically, that the outcomes didn't necessarily match what they expected, and exactly why is really a curious phenomenon. So I think we should probe that farther. We also asked people questions about their partisan connections. In particular, we asked them if they thought the two-party system had failed or if it was representing people's interests properly. And 60% agreed that the two-party system had basically failed at representing people's interests, which is way higher than any other subgroup. And so that is certainly sort of consistent with what Cecilia was finding in terms of how sort of apartisan the Latino community is. We found it was highest among younger voters and among middle-aged voters. Older voters seem to have a stronger connection to partisanship than younger voters, and that's interesting to be able to determine, what the origin of that is. We also found that men were more disaffected than women were, so it could be explaining to some degree part of what we see as the kind of gap between men and women. We found about a 7% gap between women supporting Biden and men supporting Biden. So it could be that this kind of disaffected partisanship is that part of that. It could be that Donald Trump speaks in blunt manner, which, although at least politically may not resonate with somebody, the way that he approaches politics may. So something in that vein would be of interest to be able to pursue as well. The good news is that there's a lot of optimism. And so alluding to what Cecilia said earlier, there are fairly consistent agreement that voting is a way to be able to generate power. And so 67% of people agreed that the way people vote is the main thing that decides how things are run in this country. So if they are disaffected, the vote is the antidote. And that's at least one positive report. We also found that this is highest among college educated voters and older voters. So the kind of silent generation and baby boomer generation were both more likely to see the vote as a kind of mechanism for political efficacy. We also asked people questions about whether or not their parents voted and whether or not their grandparents voted. And what we found was that the older generations tend to be turning out, at least reportedly turning out. So 59% of third generation Latinos reported their parents were voting in the last election, and 31% of third generation Latinos reported that their grandparents had voted. That's higher than it was for the second generation. So there's definitely some movement there, which is potentially of interest. We asked people blunt questions about whether or not what it was that the candidate would have to do to win their vote. We asked them whether or not it was more important to have a policy position that matched that candidate, whether a personality should match that candidate, whether they had to share their values, or whether listening was the most important part. And we found that listening was the key, that 41% of Latinos said a candidate said listening and respecting another person's views is the most important factor in getting their vote. This is especially high for females and for third generation Latinos in the poll. Less important were things like shared values, although it was still important, matching a policy prescription or position, and finally personality. So the personality was the least important of the items, which may to some degree reflect the fact that Republicans, even though they may demonize the Latino community, are still interested in voting because they feel like they're connected to that person through this kind of respecting of their views. We didn't ask this in this particular poll, but we did ask it in a poll that we did in March about racism, especially racism as it led to violence. This came out right after the El Paso shooting, and what we found was that that was a radicalizing moment for many Latinos, and many of them blamed Donald Trump specifically for that. So I think a lot of people want to say that immigration is the big issue, that his behavior is part of that. They don't like him because of his discussion about immigration issues, but I don't think that's it. I think it's that there's a sense that the way he talks about these issues, especially with respect to race, are really polarizing the country and are leading to more violence. It's not the top issue for Latinos that we found in the poll, but it's higher than immigration, and it's certainly top 5 of things people care about. That is, figuring out racism and addressing racial issues. So there's a lot going on here, and I'd love to be able to get comments and questions about how this might look, but we're finding some interesting things that kind of parallel what it is that Cecilia and the top folks are finding, and there's a lot more to come. I think there's a lot of things here that we don't really understand that well, and the better we do, I think, the more we'll learn about how to really get the Latino vote out. All right.
Thanks, Brandon.
Yeah.
Next, let's turn back to Michelle so she can just say a little bit more about the Texas Organizing Project and some of the findings that Cecilia started us off with.
Sure. Yeah, I think I yielded most of my time to Cecilia for the slides, but I'll just share a little bit about our organization. So the Texas Organizing Project Education Fund is a 501c3 entity. We're a family of organizations that we just talk about under the umbrella of TOP. And at TOP, we like to say that we fight with 2 fists. The first fist is our people power fist. It is our year-round organizing on a racial and economic justice agenda. We're a membership-based organization. Our members are predominantly Black and Latino families in the largest metro areas of the state. So that's Harris County and nearby Fort Bend County, Dallas County, Bexar County, where I'm from. And we organize around issues like economic justice issues like paid sick leave, living wages, housing, public schools and proper funding of those schools, access to health care, criminal justice reform, And more recently, we've started to do some climate justice work as well, and then immigrant rights. And then our second fist is our political power fist. And that is, we do large scale voter mobilization programs at election time that specifically target unlikely voters of color. And again, with a special emphasis on Black and Latino voters, or rather potential voters. And, you know, part of why we engage with Cecilia in this work is because, so I myself have been a community organizer for 18 years. And just in our work at TOP, you know, without a like scientific, data-driven knowledge, like really just like my gut, right? The work that we do at TOP is harder in San Antonio than it is in Houston and Dallas, right? It is harder to build engagement. And I myself was feeling pretty just, you know, feeling like we needed to dig a little bit deeper to understand why it's harder, right? And sort of just because, you know, I do have, you know, Republicans in my own family, right? Like, you know, just like understanding that we're not a monolith, understanding that, you know, we are a complicated bunch, and that we don't see our government as the solution to the problems in our lives. And so, you know, I happened to see Cecilia at the right time, at an event, and said, let's have a cup of coffee, because, you know, we need to better understand, right? And we have this working theory at our organization that, you know, the way to create that cycle of participation is that, you know, we understand people don't vote because it doesn't matter, right? And I'm not saying because they don't think that it matters. I'm acknowledging that it doesn't matter 9 times out of 10, right? And that we actually, what has to change is not just getting people to cast a ballot, but we actually have to change the relationship between the elected official or our government officials, back to the voter, right? That cycle of accountability, right? So if somebody votes, we have to demonstrate that things will change. And then when things change, they say, oh, when I vote, things will change, so I will keep voting, right? And so that's how you create that cycle. But things actually changing have to be part of that equation. Otherwise, we won't turn people into regular voters. And we had seen in previous focus groups that people had said, and Latinos in particular, like, when I have voted in the past, nothing changed, so I don't vote anymore. And so, you know, really just, again, as an organizer who sits on, you know, I have sat on thousands of couches in my career, have thousands of conversations every year with, you know, low to moderate income Latino and Black families, recognizing that we needed a tool for our work so that we could challenge our elected officials in terms of their responsibility, right? I think I appreciated Professor Rottinghaus's, you know, don't blame the voter, right? Like, it is, we cannot blame Latinos for that participation gap, right? There's a reciprocal relationship and there's a reciprocal responsibility that requires all of us, right? And I think as our organization, you know, we aim to be an intervention in that relationship and to ensure some accountability. And I think, you know, as we've been talking about the results of this study, and people have been asking us questions, and we've really been honing in on, you know, one, a sense of belonging, having a community of voting, right? That's very important, right? So community organizations can fill that void if it doesn't exist, like within the family structure, or, you know, I mean, it could be a PTA, it could be, you know, in any kind of organization where you begin to feel like you have a home for civic participation, and that, you know, really challenging this notion around, you know, Latinos being apathetic or uninformed, and that, you know, our elected officials, I think it's really important for us to be clear that this reciprocal relationship that we're talking about that is missing with the Latino community. Elected officials engage in reciprocal relationships with the constituencies that they think are important every day of the year, right? So that we're not actually asking for something different or something hard or something that they don't already do. It requires a shift, and I think it requires, educational institutions, it requires community groups to really call on, not just elected officials, but any, government officials. I mean, I think, I've had plenty of conversations with the city manager, the city of San Antonio, about how the way that they're structured is not designed for my participation, much less the entire neighborhood that I live in or the community that I'm a part of, right? Like these are not systems that are designed for our participation, and that we really do have to push if that is going to change, right? And that these are things that they're already doing, right? They're just not doing it with Latinos.
Okay, thank you for your thoughts. Now let's move to Jeronimo Cortina, who will talk a little bit more about Texas voting and what's going on now certainly in Harris County and other places in terms of the Latino vote. So Jeronimo.
All right, thank you, Jason. But first of all, let me thank Cecilia, Brandon, you, Jason, and Michelle for joining us today. And also, I would like to thank our director, Dr. Quiroz, and my chair, Jeffrey Church, and of course, my college, to our dean, and also the Division of Research at the University of Houston that helped us create this project since last year, I think. And of course, we're very thankful to Univision that agreed to do this partnership with us. And this just demonstrates that, CMAS and also the University of Houston, we are ready to play in the big leagues. And this research shows to a certain extent what we're capable of. So let me just share another part of this big 2020 election project, and something that we started working on with early voting. And this, to a certain extent, points what we're doing in terms of trying to understand better the Latino vote. So what we did is we basically analyzed the data for early voting in Harris County, that is the biggest county in the state of Texas. And we separated by age group. So we analyzed voting in-person data by generation and by race and ethnicity, and by sex or gender or sexual orientation. So we are going to talk about, the famous Gen Zs, those who are 18 to 23 years of age, our dear millennials, 24 to 39. My group, the Generation X, Xers, I'm in the lower, part of the almost a millennial. I'm, scratching the Gen X age group, baby boomers, and then the silent generation. So basically what we found is that recently registered Latinos, and that is those Latinos that registered to have an effective date of participation as of 11/3, tomorrow being the first time that they can vote in the November election, were significantly more likely to vote at every generational level than cohorts that register before 2020. Obviously, for the case of Gen Zs, are those that voted register for the 2018 election. Obviously, here, one of the most important things that we found is that younger Latinos were completely fired up in terms of voting in this election. And they outpaced the other generational cohort by around 20%. So it's very interesting to see that, to a certain extent, those younger Latinos participated at a higher rate than those that have been registered for many years. So this, points out to the fact that voting is an exercise. Voting is something that requires to put it in practice every single election. So with this new cohort of young voters, I think as community organizers or even political parties have a real opportunity to make this as a habit and create, as Michelle was saying, this community of voting, which is going to be extremely important. Other very interesting thing is when we were comparing non-Hispanic male turnout, non-Hispanic female turnout. So again, we see younger folks participating at very important higher elections. And I think that the fact that we're living in this context, the fact that we are living in a pandemic, the fact that the political system radically changed after 2016 with the election of President Trump illustrates that these voters are really motivated. And it's a very important context because it gives us some sort of an idea of what it takes to motivate, especially young people, to participate. And also, if you look, for example, at the silent generation, we see that those people that were not registered and just registered for this election a few months ago also outpaced their generational cohorts that were registered before this presidential election. And also those, right, Generation X and baby boomers, for males and females, also were outpaced in turnout, at least in early voting. So this is very encouraging in terms of political context matter and elections matter. The context of an election matters for creating the necessary enthusiasm for voters to participate. When we look at Hispanic turnout, we see also something extremely interesting, right? And that is the participation by males, by Hispanic Latino males, also outpace their generational cohorts. But the most interesting thing that we found is Latina participation. And I think the role that Latinas play in politics sometimes is not highlighted enough. And historically in the Latino community, especially here in Texas, we know that Latina women are the organizers of the community. We have the historical tamaladas to create fundraiser for community projects, and we have many other examples in which Latina women were basically dragging people to the polls, especially husbands and brothers, so they can participate. So it's extremely interesting to see this, and also the fact that, you know, the silent generation Latinas and also for Latinos, they had a huge participation, even bigger than that of non-Hispanic voters. So that's also very interesting because to me it shows that these intergenerational households, the role that political assimilation is taking place is extremely important. Why? Because we don't have those traditional socializing agents like perhaps, you know, churches or community organizations in a neighborhood that were in charge historically, at least, you know, in the 40s, 60s, to be in charge of politically socializing newcomers or basically younger generations. So we see now, and my hunch here is that those younger Latinos that were very enthused to participate in this election actually ask parents or grandparents and aunts and aunts, etc., that were able to register and actually cast a ballot. And finally, we have here the growth rate between recently registered voters and those cohorts that registered before 2020. And what we see is that the growth among particularly Hispanic females was extremely high in comparison to other groups, in comparison to Latino men, in comparison to non-Hispanic females, and in comparison to non-Hispanic males. So this shows really the power that women have in to play in this, and perhaps is why we found in our survey that Latinas were targeted at a higher rate than other particular groups. Also, it's also very interesting, and I have to thank Hector de Leon for, you know, his wisdom and guidance trying to navigate all these data, because without his support we would not be able to have this whole project in which we created a daily story map of turnout by partisanship, Latino turnout on a story map that it's in CMAS website. You can access and look at how the vote in Harris County behave over the course of these 18 days in a visual story. So let me just finish by highlighting some of the points and try to gather everything together. So one of the most important things is that the Latino vote is not a homogeneous vote, and that's extremely important. That's what complicates to a certain extent how political parties and government officials interact with Latino voters. Why? Because the mind of a political consultant or the mind of a political party is return on investment. If I'm going to invest $1 on a particular group, I want to see that return in a vote or 2 votes or 3 votes. And given that the Latino vote is more heterogeneous, then we can find more complications in terms of how to do outreach. So there is a lack of knowledge on part of these political parties and also government officials of how to create these talks, as Cecilia and Michelle spoke, how to create this real talk in order to create a little bit more of participation. And lastly, another very important point that we mentioned in terms of what we found in our surveys, but also, the narrative that we've been listening, Latinos are voting for President Trump at a higher rate, etc., etc. On the one hand, illustrates the diversity of the Latino vote in terms of not all Latinos are Republicans, not all Republicans are Latinos, and vice versa, but also highlights to a certain extent the lack of understanding from some news organizations in terms of how to conduct research with the Latino vote. And why this is important? Well, it's important because you have to look at how this type of research is conducted. How do you conduct a sampling frame? How do you conduct who you're going to interview? Which mode of interview you're going to use? So I guess for what we're going to see tomorrow and in the next couple of days is actually how many Latinos actually supported one candidate or the other. But I think that it's important for us to start these talks with a little bit of skepticism in terms of methodologies and in terms of if we're recreating the narrative that has been created since 2000, right? In terms of the sleeping giant waking up and so on and so forth. And I think that the numbers that I just showed, at least in Harris County, illustrate that this sleeping giant is actually waking up, and once it wakes up, it's going to have very important implications for the rest. As what's going to happen tomorrow, I'm going to leave that to Jason, because he's a better prognosticator than I am, and since 2016 I don't do predictions anymore. Thank you very much for your time, and let me send it back to you, Jason.
Okay, thank you. We don't have time for my predictions, so we're going to move right into the questions. So we have some questions in the chat. I'd like to get to them right away because we have about 12 minutes to go. Professor Tejada asked Cecilia, I don't know if she sees it on the chat box, but I'll just briefly read it, about the narratives in the ethnographic interviews and in terms of the role of education in the formation of a political identity. And he also asked about voter engagement based on languages employed by those interviewed. So Cecilia, could you see if you can address Professor Tejada's questions?
Sure. I didn't hear much overt sort of consciousness among our interviewees about how it was the education system that failed them in being able to form a political identity. But we just didn't hear stories of people learning any of this, right? And on the contrary, sometimes when we saw politicized Latinos, they told a story of having, not all of them, but having taken, for example, an ethnic studies class in college, or learning about racism in general, or learning how to understand systemic issues of discrimination. And so I do think the failings are situated in the education system, but I'm not sure that they were articulating that themselves. But we did see that play out. And as far as findings about voter engagement based on the language that they spoke, we didn't find any we could not draw a direct line between language use and political participation. But there were different experiences that people had, in part based on their immigrant status and or linguistics, that affects a sense of belonging. About a quarter of the people we interviewed were foreign born. And so those interviews were mostly in Spanish. And that roughly reflects the proportion of Latino voters who are foreign born. And so on the one hand, some of them are not as integrated into their communities or economic systems, political systems. On the other hand, I think Michelle had mentioned this, that Top anecdotally noticed that it can be easier to turn a naturalized citizen who doesn't vote into a voter. There is, among some of them, and especially their children, first gen, there's an openness to doing things differently, to new ideas. Whereas once you get to a second, third, fourth generation, the ideas are more entrenched. On the other hand, with English-speaking and US-born Latinos, some of them are more politicized, or they do have a sense of empowerment or belonging. And yet others who hadn't experienced that, as I mentioned, that became more entrenched. So I think in both communities, you see, some people who have some advantages in terms of being able to turn on to civic engagement more easily or not. But that's another, I think this research opened up a lot of other research that we can be doing that would be a great thing to follow up on.
Okay, thank you. The next question, David Reese, I think he asked this while Brandon was doing his presentation on meaningful differences between Latinos and the general population. Must be referring to some of the public opinion data there.
There's a lot. I'll just say that off the top of my head, the one thing that stuck out to me was like what Texans wanted from like the election, and then what they wanted government to focus on after the election. Most Texans, like overall, if you aggregate, wanted COVID. That was the big thing, and then it was border security. For Latinos, it was jobs, the economy, then a couple of other things, and then it was affecting like solving racism and addressing racial issues, and then immigration was like 4 or 5. So the priorities were different, and there are lots of ways that like that manifest, but for sure there were differences in terms of like what they wanted from government.
Good. And Richard says that we need to advise voters that voting alone will not always create change. They must engage with and within the system. So perhaps maybe, I don't know, Michelle might be able to sort of comment, if you want to comment on that statement.
Yeah, our partisan organization is right now, we've reached out to 1.4 million unlikely voters of color across Texas. About 800,000 of them are Latinos. And, when we knock on someone's door, we are often told that we're the first person to ever knock on their door. And to Jeronimo's point earlier about, if you're a candidate running for office, your math is, I got to get 50% plus 1. And so I'm going to go and persuade 50% plus 1 of the people I know are going to vote for me, right? And so the doors that we're knocking on are people who are ignored by the campaigns because they don't already have a regular vote history. So, the first thing we do is we ask, like, what issues do you care about, right? What's important to you? What's going on in your life right now? And then somewhere on this ballot, somebody can make a decision, right, about what's impacting you. And so, and then we're always very clear to say, great, so first step is we got to vote. Then we got to hold the people we just elected accountable to actually deliver for our neighborhoods, right? So it is, you're absolutely right that, and it's a responsibility that we have, right? As people who, like, as an organization that acts as an intervention in that relationship, to be perfectly clear, it is not enough to vote. Things don't change without, look at, the uprisings we had this summer, right? Like the massive public participation in the streets that we had this summer. And then, there was a massive outcry to defund police departments all over the country, and how little defunding actually happened, right? So, you know, we always have to be careful in creating that cycle of participation that, you know, real systemic change is, it takes time, unfortunately, right? I think we all, I mean, I wish, you know, I've been doing this for 18 years. And, you know, but we have to set that expectation that it's not enough to vote. And that, you know, we say in Texas, we need 1 million new voters at the polls, and we need 1 million people in the streets in order to see our values reflected back to us from our government. And it's like two sides of the same coin. That, and so I appreciate the comment that was made, because it's, voting is step one. Accountability is step two.
Thank you. And Veronica kind of asked a question which I think builds on this in the whole aspect of participation, right? And she asked, how would we advise educators about how to teach Latino participation? And she mentions that the usual that's taught is that Latinos would not be expected to participate, you know, according to the standard models of political participation, you know, in the political science literature stemming back from Verba, Schlossman, and Brady, which is the seminal book there. So, so I guess how can we think about Veronica's question? How would you advise educators to teach Latino participation? I guess this is for any of our panelists.
I think that, you know, part of it is what, you know, our data suggests, and also Cecilia's and obviously Michelle's work for the past 18 years, is that you have to make young Latinos understand that their participation is crucial. And one way of doing this is by bringing the government to their daily lives, right? Trying to illustrate why voting for a, you know, city manager or someone that is going to represent them in their independent school district matters, and how that particular public policy is going to be translated into affecting their daily lives one way or the other. And, you know, one way is to illustrate that the government is present in our daily lives. The first thing that you do when you get into your car is buckle up. And that's part of a federal regulation. That's part of state law. That's part of city laws, right? And it's the first thing that you do. We have seatbelts because there were laws created. So trying to bring it down to the mere fact of how government and how their participation is going to change the type of policies and the type of output that those policies create, I think it's going to be important. And also, you know, the part of what Michelle does, and kudos to her and the other organizations that do this, is to go and have these conversations, because these communities are politically disenfranchised, not because, as Brandon said, because they're at fault, but because there is no dialogue, and because the way that we operationalize politics is in a I guess transactional nature. I value you because you're my constituency and you're gonna vote for me. But when you're talking to young voters, it's like, you know, a guy like my age, right, 35, is not gonna be, or does not have, the same policy preferences that you have. I'm worried about, you know, mortgages. You're not worried about mortgages. You're worried about if you can pay your higher education or not. I'm worried about the stock market, for instance, right? You're not worried about those stuff. So those politicians are going to react to my needs, wants, and preferences. If you don't vote, they don't care about you. As simple as that. And that is the transactional nature of politics. And that happens here and in every single democracy in the world.
If I can just jump in quickly to add to that, I think also my colleague Michael Powell is telling me, you know, this teaching cultural history is so important, and teaching the stories of those struggles of the Latino community to be seen and to be heard. The Latino Civil Rights Movement in Texas. And also we can rethink what civics education is and who can participate in that. So cultural arts institutions, for instance, we interviewed a couple of people who are working class, had a very strong sense of empowerment, and they were very active in mariachi or in another cultural institution. And so there was sometimes a correlation between people's relationship with their own ethnic identity and their sense of place and history and how they were thinking about voting. And so I just wanted to add those two things.
Thank you. Anyone else want to comment on that? Okay, we have a really interesting question from Carlos about the regional differences, comparing Arizona, Texas, and Florida Latinos. I don't know if Brandon wants to comment on that. I think he mostly presented the Texas results.
Yeah, those are all Texas
Yeah.
results. There are some differences. Florida more conservative, certainly among certain key groups. In Arizona, probably slightly more to the left than Texas. I think that the disaffection was higher in Texas. It seemed like other states had better feelings of empowerment. Exactly why, I don't know. I'd like to explore more, but it did feel like there were some real differences in terms of how Texas Latinos were like connected to the system than other groups. It could just be, party strength. It could be the kind of longevity of the political arrangement, but there were some differences that weren't just about party that were pretty interesting. So it's something unique about Texas that that the vote is a little different than other places.
There's a very long
Cecilia.
discrimination against Mexican Americans and then of party dominance, right? So I wonder if those two things play into that. That's very interesting. And I'd also say that like when we see that disaffection, that we're careful not to turn that into that popular discourse that Latinos don't care, but rather, like you said, that they're ambivalent, that they're dissatisfied with authority and they don't believe that the system can change something in their lives.
Yeah, I would also add maybe more as a question, I think Arizona, it does come down to investment in resources, to Jeronimo's point about this is a transaction in politics. I mean, unfortunately, that's very true. And like Arizona has been considered a battleground state. Texas is now getting recognized as such, right? Just in the last few weeks. So, Arizona has also had more investment over time. And part of that investment, I mean, I will say, we see this in Texas as well. Overwhelmingly, investment comes into the state and it is, focused on swing white voters or swing House districts. And, unfortunately, most of our people live in a safe Democratic seat. So they're not even necessarily talking to the regular voters that they know that they can rely on unless it's a primary and they have a challenger, right? Like there's, I deliberately am waiting until election day to vote because I live in a safe Democratic seat just to see how many pieces of mail I get. And it was 2, and I have friends who were getting like 50 pieces of mail because they live in a more competitive district, right? So, nobody cared if I showed up to vote in this election, or maybe they just took for granted that I will. So, I think in Arizona, you had a real call to action around Sheriff Arpaio even, right? That there has been a real investment there. And so I would be curious to see if that has had an impact, just knowing how we work with grassroots organizations in Arizona, and actually have learned a lot from them, with our own Show Me Your Papers law.
Exactly.
Right, like we actually had some of them come for the big day of action at the Capitol and do a teach-in with us and things like that. So, I think that there's, I just would be curious about the impact of like actual resources coming from the Democratic Party and what impact that has.
And also, with Proposition 187, at the same time, remember that it was Rick Perry, Texas legislature and obviously the governor said were quote unquote considering. And one of the quotes of Rick Perry that I never forget is that Texas ain't Arizona, right? And he was referring to a certain extent to the type of maturity in the Latino community here in Texas that during, before 2016, the Republican Party in Texas was primarily, a vision of if ain't broke, don't fix it, right? Don't mess with that. And we have very important historical examples. The Texas Proviso in the 1940s, 60s, etc., etc. But then everything changed, and I think that the community in Arizona learned very fast how to organize, right? You have that external shock, aka Sheriff Arpaio 187, that forced them to create a fast track, learn how to organize in 2 seconds, and created that more mobilization. And that's why now the community is taking more seriously, because politicians were able to see, oh, they know how to organize, they know how to vote, they know how to mobilize. And here in Texas, we're starting to see that, but yet that shock, and given that our population is highly geographically dispersed, creates very important challenges for organizing and having, as Michelle is saying, that I guess a specific weight to say, if my community doesn't vote, you're not gonna win, period. But we're seeing that Latinos are any politician that wants to win in Texas, and that's going to be true for the country in the next couple of election cycles. Latinos have to be in the winning coalition if they expect to win, and that's a reality. So it's a reality that needs to, political parties have to understand that very fast.
Yeah, I think Jeronimo, that's right. And one of the other things I'd like to just mention about this is, let me see if there's anyone else. I don't want to dominate here as we move in our curriculum changes. Okay, are there any other questions before we break? We still have some time. We don't have to stop right at, well, we're past 7, but we still have a few more minutes.
David Ruiz had asked one further.
Oh, David, okay. Was that the one about the differences? I think we may have covered that one. Let's see. The meaningful differences between Latinos and the general population. Yeah, I think Brandon mentioned that one earlier, talked about it.
It looks like people really want your prediction.
I know, right?
I'm curious how yours compares to our prediction.
So prediction. All right. So let's be more specific, right? What predictions on what specifically? In Texas, right? This is the big question, right? So yeah, I mean, I think as was just mentioned, right, Texas all of a sudden kind of became a battleground state, right? And I think the Biden campaign just kind of was caught by surprise. And, now they they sent Kamala Harris to Texas a few days ago, kind of as a last minute thing. I mean, I think the fundamentals in Texas suggest, if you look at a 9-point victory for Trump in 2016, require a big change in turnout, obviously. And as Jeronimo mentioned, what's going on in Harris County might predict this. I still think Trump will eke it out in Texas this cycle, but I think it'll be a big wake-up call to Republicans in the state that they need to change. And this is one of the things that I was going to bring up and talk about with the rest of the panel. The extent to which the coronavirus and the pandemic has disproportionately affected Latino families in Texas. And, we think about mobilization and what's driving mobilization. And Jeronimo mentions California and Proposition 187, this sort of anti-immigrant rhetoric, and that's driving sort of a sense of mobilization to counter that. I wonder if sort of the coronavirus, in essence, and this disproportionate impact, has that been a source of mobilization among Latinos, whether it's in Texas or other parts of the country? Because, immigration hasn't been a huge issue this campaign because the pandemic has kind of overshadowed it, along with the economy, which is related. So I don't know if there's any comments about that. Cecilia? Yeah.
Yeah, it was Michelle's great idea that we go back to 20 people that we had interviewed during the coronavirus, because we were like, we can't release the report right now. The media is not going to pay attention. So we instead took a little more time with the research and spoke with 20 non-voters and sporadic voters and tried to see how COVID was impacting their lives and their views of the election. And yeah, the big finding is that, you know, if when we talk about non-voters, we mentioned that they have a hard time connecting government to their lives. So how does policy directly impact your life? And basically COVID functioned as a big civics lesson where they became very, very aware on a daily basis how those decisions directly impacted their lives and how there was government at different levels. And they were very exasperated with those governments not coordinating and not being sure what to do. And yeah, their lives have been impacted tremendously, especially economically. I don't know if the ones that we spoke with had a sense that they were more impacted than other groups, but the anxiety was very, very strong. The need was strong. And so, yeah, I think the thing is, you know, sometimes some other non-voters, they become voters because they experience an issue with the immigration system. So it can be a life circumstance that teaches you how government works. And I think this is one of them.
Yeah, we found that when, you know, people had more attention to or connection to the coronavirus, whether they had gotten it or had friends who had gotten it, they were more likely to be engaged in the system. And I think that the results show that they were more likely to vote for Biden, in part because I think that they saw the incumbent as being less able to handle that. So that definitely was happening. And we know that across the board, the dozens of questions we asked about the coronavirus, that it was affecting Latinos in significant ways. And how exactly to quantify that from like people's responses, I don't really know, but for sure there's a lot of anxiety and disappointment for how governments handled it. So it's become a big issue, and it might be the one issue that really does shift a lot of attention away from immigration. And there are many ways that Democrats can connect to the Latino vote, and this might be another one of those ways.
Okay. All right. Well, unless there are any other questions, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for these great discussion that we just had, and thank all of you for tuning in to this discussion. Thank the University of Houston Center for Mexican American Studies, Division of Research, Jeronimo Cortina for putting this together for us, Brandon Rottinghaus, Cecilia Ballí, and Michelle Tremillo. Thank you so much for joining us. And make sure you vote tomorrow if you haven't done so already.
Thank you.